So welcome to a guide to a boring and uneventful go live. I know this is the last session of the day, so everyone's a bit tired, but I hope we'll have a little bit of fun today and hopefully have time for some questions. And my friends who are leaving, if you could perhaps shut the door. Think they got us? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, Lauren, it's a bit noisy in here. So I am Tara Barnett. I am a Folio Services Analyst with Index Data, and I'm joined by Lauren. We're going to introduce ourselves in just a second, but just to remind you what we're here to do today, besides learn how to use computers. So this is the session that you are here for. Hopefully you're in the right session. So our goal today is to walk you through some of the processes that we use in real migrations that we've worked on to ensure that our go lives are boring, uneventful, and completely drama-free. That's what everyone wants for their go live, right? No one wants excitement in this particular region of their life. So you're going to leave here with some helpful tactics that you can use in your folio migrations and beyond to keep chaos out of your projects. Folio migrations are a little bit difficult to describe in the abstract, so we're going to focus pretty specifically, but hopefully we'll all learn something interesting. How many people in this room are migrating to Folio currently? Wow, Lauren, that's like a whole bunch of hands in here. And on Zoom, I'm sure there are additional hands as well. I don't think any of you are migrating with index data though, right? Okay, so I will say this a couple of times, but just because I said something doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be true for you. In general, yes, and the vibe is right, but maybe you'll be told something different, and that's totally fine too. Okay. So again, this is me. I'm Tara. I had longer hair at one point. I work on Folio implementations. I do a lot of support, and I also do a lot of migrations. I know some people in this room also know I do a lot of training. It's my favorite part of my job. So that's me. And then my friend Lauren is on the screen right there and also slightly larger. Lauren, do you want to introduce yourself?
That does look like a very big headshot. Hi, I'm Lauren Sini. I'm Tara's colleague, and pretty much everything that she said she does is what I do as well. I'll also be monitoring the chat, so if anybody online wants to post questions in there, I will be keeping an eye out for it.
Awesome. And then I did also just want to acknowledge the ghost in the room who didn't get a headshot on a slide. My boss, Mike Gurrell, has done this presentation at WOLFcon before. And if any of you have seen this presentation as given by him, I think it'll be interesting to see sort of the difference between how I describe migrations and how he describes migrations. And I was mentioning to our friends earlier, we'll also see if you can spot which slides I made and which slides Mike made. Okay, so Lauren, I'm going to sort of minimize you on this screen so you won't be quite so large. There we go. But speak up if you're trying to catch our attention. So to start out, who we are as a company. So Index Data is a vendor, and we provide many services, including hosting, migrations, and support. Right. So your system can live with us. We can get you onto a system. We can support you once you're on a system. Right. And today we're going to be mainly focusing on folio migrations. We also do reshare migrations. We also do viewfind migrations. I'm sure we've done other migrations for software that predates me somehow. But today we're going to be focusing on Folio. If you're interested in learning more about index data, you can go to that website. As I said just a moment ago, not all libraries are migrated by index data, and all of that is fine. Additionally, every migration is unique. So we work with academic libraries. We work with the only public library in the US who's on Folio. We work with museum libraries. There's more than one right way to do a migration. So let's try and keep that in mind. And without any further stalling, let's get to how to migrate a library to Folio. Yay! So this is an overview of what happens in a Folio migration, right? So these are all of the things that we need to take care of in order to get you on Folio. We need to get you oriented to Folio. You need to understand the basics of how Folio works. We need to set up your Folio system. You need an actual system in which to do that migration. We need to map your data and your processes from your current system to Folio. We need to develop workflows that are specific to Folio, so new things that you're going to have to do in Folio. We're going to have to practice your migration. So we're going to have to do sort of dry runs and like make sure that we actually know how to move the data quickly and in time. We're going to plan and implement integrations and discovery. Along the way, we're going to track our progress. We're going to communicate. We're going to identify and remove blockers. We're going to train staff, and then we're going to execute. And by that, I believe we mean go live. And you can tell who wrote this slide because we're missing an Oxford comma there. Some of the definitions and terms that we use are data mapping and loading. So this is the ETL extract, transform, load process for each data set. Workflow analysis, we look at what workflows you have and how to map those into Folio. We talk about how to work around things that we know are going to be quite different from your current system and into Folio. So if Folio isn't going to be able to do something the exact way that you've done it in the past, what changes can we make to your processes or your use of Folio to make the end result happen, right? We also sometimes use the term acceptance testing. So we talk about testing your data to make sure that it was mapped and migrated correctly and in ways that support those workflows that you're going to need to do. This one is super important and one of the only things that we cannot do for you. So we really fixate on that one right there. When we use the term dry run, we're basically saying we're going to do a dress rehearsal migration, a practice migration. Essentials testing is testing that everything that really matters has been looked at the right time, basically. And then go live is high fives and beer. Apparently that's the definition of go live. We'll come back to that one. So this diagram is not very beautiful. However, it is sort of accurate. So we're going to go through it real quick. So on this side, we have sort of like the iterative process of how we get data into your system. So there's data mapping and loading, there's workflow analysis, and there's workflow planning. And then we actually load the data and we actually test those workflows. And then we say, nah, that wasn't quite right. And we go back and we do it all again until everything is perfect, right? And once we've done that so many times that your system is like made of diamonds, we move on and we do our dry runs. We do additional testing, and we do that as many times as we have to. And when we're ready, or when we have to do it because you're going to lose access to your current system, we go live. So that's what this diagram right here represents. And sometimes people will come up and ask me sort of like, what skills do I need in order to run a Folio migration? And I gave this some thought, and in general, it's mostly listening. There are some general tactics and skills that help us with project management, but it's easier to see when you're actually on a project. But the ones that I really want you to keep an eye out for are communication, documentation, and clarification. So by communication, I mean, do the right people know the right things, right? By documentation, I mean that we want to remember what those right things are. So it's very easy to make a decision and then lose track of when you made that decision or what the decision was in sort of like the drift of conversation that happens during a migration. I mean, the last step is clarification. So making sure that everyone knows the same things in exactly the same way, right? So it's very easy to sort of drift apart in your understanding of what seems like a very straightforward thing. So I might be saying we're gonna pull your data out on Friday, and you might be hearing 9 a.m. and I might be meaning after closing. That's a very simple example. So as we are moving through this process, let's make sure we remember how important the CDC is. Okay, setting the stage. So before you even start migrating, our analysts are going to be working on your migration. And hopefully to you, that looks like magic. You don't even know this is happening. But because you often don't see this work, I thought you might find it kind of interesting. So some of the key things that we're going to resolve ahead of time is setting up internal project plans, making sure we have all of the information we need in order to set up your system. So really silly things like, what should the test system URL be? We have to know that. We can't just magically intuit it, so we have to ask. We're going to be setting up all of those worksheets, forms, and creating tickets and creating documents that we're going to need later on in the migration, right? We're going to be communicating internally about the dates that we need to know. So like things like your go live date, when we think we're going to do those dry runs, things like that. We're going to be making sure that we are all on the same page about really important key facts, like what system you are killing off, for example. And also just sort of about the migration as a whole and any problems that we anticipate happening ahead of time. We'll also probably be creepily Googling your institution so that we know things about, you know, the services that you might use and the people at your institution. We like to have a nice preview. At Index Data, we don't use traditional planning software, and there's a winky face here because sometimes on the back end I do use traditional planning software, but we like to be cool and use spreadsheets. These are not particularly detailed. They're sort of more like a to-do list. So some of the tasks might be getting your inventory data and filling out your mapping sheet, right? These are always tailored to the library, the analyst, and the project. So sometimes if a project's very simple, they might be more condensed. And if it is very complicated, they might have multiple pages. things like that. In addition to that project plan, we also sometimes use a checklist to make sure that you on your side get a full sense of the migration process. And we'll look at sort of part of a checklist later on in this presentation. But I did want to mention a lot of times libraries have their own vision of how this is going to work from their side, right? So you've got your checklist and you've got your project plans. And it's really helpful for us at least to know what's on those lists, in particular, if you have any deadlines that we wouldn't know about, right? Sometimes those don't come out until they are a little bit close for us to accommodate. So it's helpful if we're all sharing the same documentation as much as we can. And I did just want to talk about sort of the internal communication that you are never, ever going to see, but that helps us to serve you as a library. So even the staff that you never meet directly actually knows quite a bit about your library and is very excited to be working with you. So this is an actual quote from me on Slack as I was introducing a project and letting people know that we were going to be doing this migration. I said, they're a library for a really cool museum. It's all like narwhals and ships and witches. So if you would like to figure out who that is, best of luck to you. But we really try to sort of hype you up internally so that everyone from DevOps, the people doing the data migration, knows that you're really cool and we're all on the same page and invested in this project. So just like you're going to be selling your team on change management internally, we're making sure that our team is ready and excited to work with you on this project. As I said, we know that you're busy before we even start, but we try not to be too nosy, so we don't always know exactly what you've been up to on your side. But based on the things that happen to make it to us, we can guess that you are gathering questions, that you're learning more about the system you're migrating to. Obviously, you investigated it before you chose it, but now maybe you're going to Snapshot or coming to WOLFcon and you're learning all about the things that are in your system, right? You're probably also planning out communication, both internal communication and communication to your institution as a whole. And you may also still be figuring out those key dates, so when you want to migrate and things like that. A lot of times libraries are worried and they think that they perhaps should be doing something that they don't know about yet because while this is my, I don't know, like 20th migration, it is probably not the 20th migration that you have done in the past 3 years. Maybe the first one that you've done in 20 years, for example. So if you're wondering if you should be doing something, just ask. We're also setting up all of our project communication tools. So we are trying to get our weekly and biweekly meetings set. There's one of us, but there may be 20 of you who need to attend these meetings. So maybe you need a running start on getting that on people's calendars. We're setting up running agendas. We're setting up what's going to be on our agendas. We're creating a Slack site so that we have regular communication. We're setting up how we're going to share documents. This is such a simple thing that can be so complicated, getting everyone on the same Google site. And then finding out that 2 people can't use Google and changing to a completely different file sharing system. And we are also setting up issue management processes. So almost always that just means more spreadsheets. We love a spreadsheet. So the point that I wanted to make is there is no laundry fairy, but the migration fairy is hard at work. Have you guys ever heard the laundry fairy? So the laundry fairy is the magical fairy who comes and picks up all your laundry off the floor and delivers it directly to your drawers. My mother used to say this to me a lot, that there is no laundry fairy. So someone is doing that work, but hopefully to you it feels as magical as my laundry being done when I was 7. Okay, so our curtain rises on our migration, and we have our players. So these are some of the roles that people might play in a migration. Index data often staffs the roles with the icons, but not always. We work with a lot of institutions that choose to fill these roles themselves. Anyone in any of these roles? Do you see yourself in these roles? I see some nodding. There's probably, if I had to guess, at least a training coordinator in here because some of you were at my session. Oops. And there is almost certainly some project leadership and some project managers in this room and on Zoom. So, but it's interesting that we have also worked with libraries that bring their own project managers. So especially when we work with a consortium, some people bring their own. I also wanted to point out that people are going to play multiple roles in your migration. It's not always that important to know which of these roles you yourself are playing or others in your institution are playing. Like casting the migration is maybe not the most important thing. But sometimes it is. So sometimes you have a very clear idea of what you do and do not want your vendor to do for you, and it helps to be clear about that upfront, right? So sometimes our analysts serve as domain experts. I've worked with libraries where I did a significant part of setting up their circ rules, for example, or I did a significant part of mapping their item data because they were a smaller library and they needed help with those things. But I've also worked with libraries that are quite large and have extremely specific requirements for inventory, and they kind of don't want me in their business, and that's fine too. So we'll try and sort of suss that out as we're moving. But it's something that you should think about ahead of time. On the library side, we don't always ask you to give us your cast list to go with that metaphor. But there are often a few roles that we ask you to define explicitly. And one of them is person who gets the final say. This is a really important one because at least at Index Data, we may be working directly with staff all over your institution, and it's not always clear to us who's in charge of who's in charge of what, right? So we may take information from someone who normally does metadata and say like, oh, well, Bob said that this field on the item record should work this way. We're like, great, we'll make that change. And then it turns out that the person who owns that data is actually someone else entirely, and we've just messed up your whole data mapping, right? So we often ask you to tell us who gets to say what the final decision is on your side. Your level of formal organization is going to be specific to you, and we're Index Data, so we're happy to squeeze ourselves in wherever. We're like little weasels. So who at your library should be involved in your migration? Well, it depends on your library. Some migration teams are very small, others are very large, but I'm sure it will come as a surprise to no one that my ultimate answer is everyone. Everyone's going to be involved in your migration because everyone is migrating, right? So really it's a question of when, right? So you may choose to keep your migration team a little bit tight at the beginning, and that's a great way to control information and to control decision making and to be efficient. But ultimately, everyone is eventually going to be involved. So it's important to keep everyone engaged as best you can. And then just sort of a little side note, our system, we often assume that people know this, but just in case, we do all of the testing for migration in the system that's ultimately going to become your test system. So all of the libraries that I work with have both a production and a test system. So if we make a mistake in that system, it's okay. We can just delete everything. It's totally fine. We don't have to get things right the first time, and there's nothing that we can do to this system that's irreparable. And then finally, one of the very few sort of like big events that we do during migration is a kickoff. So during this meeting, we usually do introductions, and Index Data staff are going to give an overview of the entire process that will look an awfully lot like the meeting that you're currently in. Sometimes our libraries want to run these, but often they want us to run them for you. It sort of depends on what the vibe is. It sounds fun, but sometimes it can be dry as you're listening to me list off every single data point in Folio. So we appreciate your patience during these meetings. All right, so moving on, the main event. Then we migrate everything, the end. So it's not quite that simple. So we do actually break down your migration into quite a few steps here. So to break this down a little bit further, typically the order that we migrate data in is of the data that you have, we'll migrate it in this order. So we'll usually start with inventory, then we'll move on to users, then we'll do acquisitions, then we'll do ERM, and then we'll do any sort of resource access data that you may have. So that's loans, requests. It really depends on the institution. Anyone want to guess why we do it in this order? That's right. So we do it in this order because there are dependencies in the data in Folio, right? So almost everything depends on inventory, and things like resource access depend on users. So this is the order in which we do things in order to make sure that the data that's required for later stages is available in the system when we need it. So the process per each of those domains is we start with a sort of basics training. Then we set up all of the settings. We fill out a mapping sheet. We ask for your exemplar data set and load it, and then we load your full data set. We deal with any relevant integrations or decisions, and then we ask you to sort of like green light that area. And once we have said green light on a particular area of Folio, we're ideally, not always, but ideally not going to come back and change it. Because as we just said, that data is going to build up, right? So if we make a decision on inventory, and then we go and we do all of your loans, and then we go back and we change all of your inventory, then we also have to go back and do all of your loans again, right? So it's really important that we're pretty sure that your data is good when we get to that green light. There are some sort of subtasks in here, so we'll look at a full example in just a second. But when we say we're going to do your exemplar set, there's some subtasks in there, right? So we need to define your exemplar set, we need to load the exemplar set, we need to test the exemplar set, and then we need to reload, tweak, and test again until it's perfect. So this is an example that I pulled directly from one of those checklists that I was talking about. So this is what that can look like for specifically users, pulling that out of all of those data sets. I like to use users because it's a little bit complicated and it has a little bit of funny business in there, but it's fairly straightforward to understand, right? So if we were loading users, what we would do is we would start with a basics training that covers all of the fields in users and everything you might want to do with users, right? So we talk about problems that people usually have with their users loads. We talk about things like, well, how is this going to affect single sign-on, for example? So all the things that we've learned from migrations, we're going to sort of talk through those things up front before you try and map your data so that you understand what you're trying to achieve a little better. The next thing that we're going to do is that you and generally your analysts are going to complete the settings for users, right? So in order to actually load your users, we need reference data in the system. And that reference data is the patron groups, the address types, the departments, and custom fields. There are other aspects of the user settings app that are available in Folio if you've been in there. But those are the ones that loading data depends on. So those are the ones that we need to make sure you've filled out. We add any relevant note types in the notes settings. So if you want to add notes to your users, we also need to set up the note types in advance. We're going to ask you to complete your users mapping sheet. So we're going to ask you to tell us what field in your data becomes the barcode field in Folio. And we have lots of, again, spreadsheets that we like to use to get that done. We are going to go through your users exemplar set. And this is where people start to get confused. So when I ask for an exemplar set, what I mean is I need a group of users. I need a data set of users who represents your users as a whole, right? They're the exemplar set. So I know that if I have one faculty member and one user who has the delivery preference of Office and one user who is a proxy for another user, that if I have all of the users that represent all of the edge cases, then I can be sure that the data in the rest of the system is good, right? So that way you don't need to test every single user. You've tested your exemplar set, and so you know that you've accounted for every sort of contingency. The next thing that you're going to do after you've decided who those people are, who those users are, is actually extract the data from your system. And this is sometimes easy and sometimes very hard, and sometimes we ask you to do it and sometimes we do it for you. This is not even consistent across areas of data. Some people are able to extract their users but not their inventory. So we really need to work together to figure out how we're going to get this data out of your system. Once we've got it out of your system and once we know how it should be mapped, though, we can load your user exemplar set. So your Folio system will look a little bit weird. It'll have like 18 users in it, but we will know that all of our scripts to load the data are good for the same reasons that you'll be able to later tell that your users are good, right? And then we're going to ask you to test and confirm that user's exemplar set. So you're going to go through and make sure that everything you're expecting is where it's expecting, everything is working as you're expecting, things like that. Once we've made sure that the exemplar set is perfect, we're going to do our user's full load. So again, we're going to extract that full load, we're going to load that full load, and we're going to test and confirm that full load. And if we did the previous step correctly, this is going to be super quick and pretty much a formality. And if it turns out we did not do that previous step correctly, we will be doing that several times. After that, there's some interesting things that are specific to users. So for example, we're going to talk about how user loads are going to be done on an ongoing basis. So some libraries will load their own users. Some libraries only manually update their users. Some libraries have us load their users. There's a bunch of differences in approach. We're also going to talk through your user workflows. And once we've done that, we are officially done with users. Yay! Okay. Except we're not. So there is an additional group of users, which are staff users. And for the staff users, we need to configure permission sets and we need to apply or test permission sets. But we don't need to do these things at the same time, right? So we don't need to know what your permission sets are in order to move on with loading your loans, for example. So there are some things we can set aside and other things we can't. And it's helpful to know what those things are in advance. So this is an example of a mapping spreadsheet. So we have these for every single area of data in Folio that we are going to load. All they are is a list of Folio fields and what your data has as encoded as that field. So they are very long and potentially confusing spreadsheets, but they do exactly what you would think they do. But I do like to point out that people know more than a worksheet. So all of the worksheets and forms that we use are just tools. So if a worksheet were somehow going to magically populate your system, I would tell you that ahead of time because that would be weird, right? So, if a worksheet isn't clear or you want to do something that it seems like the worksheet doesn't accommodate, just let us know. We always have ways to work around that. And if you need something like split a field into 3 different folio fields. That's also achievable. We just need to talk about it ahead of time. So that's why our meetings are so important. So returning to our users process, I did just want to return to this one step of user workflows. Kind of glossed over this earlier, but it's actually kind of a big deal. So you're not crazy. There's a logical leap here. It is a circular dependency. So you need your data in order to determine your workflows. Your workflows depend on more than one type of data, right? You need to understand your workflows in order to map your data, and you need your data to create your workflows. So we've just created a cycle that we cannot possibly get out of. In a word, ick. So I, of course, as I said, have done a bazillion migrations. So I have a good idea of what the issues might be, and I can sort of try and cue you into those. But even though I said we'll never go back after we say green light, if we have to go back, we will, right? So we'll do our best to catch everything. But if we have to make a step backwards, that's okay too. And then I also wanted to highlight one other thing that I sort of skipped right over. And that is testing and confirming that exemplar set, right? So what do we mean when we say test and confirm? We sometimes call these essentials tests. So essentials tests are a select number of workflows or records that you plan to verify that will represent the whole of your migration. And so basically we're trying to say, if I make sure that X does Y, that I know that all records like X and all workflows like Y will work. So it's a way to get around having to test every single record in your system and every single thing that you do in your system. So I may not need to test every possible scenario for renewing something if I've tested one iconic case of renewal, for example. But people really don't like doing this. And I understand why, because it's hard and it's boring. And in some cases, it's actually overkill, right? So if you have a really simple scenario, maybe you actually don't need to do this type of test. Maybe you are very convinced that your data is fine, and you would prefer that I stop bothering you about it. However, as a project lead on migrations, this makes me so nervous because this is one of the only things that I cannot do for you, right? So I need you to tell me if the data in your system is correct. I need you to tell me if workflows are not covered. So you don't have to follow the essentials test model, but we really recommend that you do because unfortunately I do not work at your amazing library, and so I do not know exactly how your data should look. So some of the things people ask are, how many tests do I need to have? How many records do I need to test? What should they look like? And what specifically should we test? So I can workshop that with a library, but I can't always tell you because, again, I don't know what your data is, unfortunately. So unfortunately, this one's on you. It's one of those big responsibilities. But this is an example of a very dramatic essentials test, we'll say. So this is the strategy of sort of like listing out every single possible workflow and walking through it and assuming that a human will recognize if something has gone amiss. In this case, I believe they did not write out what the results should be because the people who are involved in this area are actually doing the testing. We have essentials tests that are as simple as like a checklist in a doc. We have ones that are even more complicated than this. We have ones that are managed in completely separate testing systems. So we've got libraries doing all sorts of things all over the place. There was a really cool session maybe at last year's WOLFcon about testing for upgrades that would be pretty applicable to this. Okay, so we're going to go through that whole process for all of the data, but beyond the data, we also have some other things we need to take care of. So one of those is integrations. And integrations are so individual that it's hard to generalize what yours are going to be. So for integrations, we usually provide a list of generic integrations. So we ask you things like, do you have an ILL system? Any ILL system? Do you have a printer at your desk? Things like that. My favorite is, do you have self-check? Are you sure? Do you want to walk around the corner and check that one for me? Things like that. It's pretty easy to forget everything that touches your library system in every way. So I do have a set of everything that myself and I believe a former colleague could think of that could possibly touch a library system. And we use that as kind of a trigger list to help you figure out what your specific integrations might be. So once you've narrowed down your specific list of integrations, and we're going to ask you things like, well, what specific self-check machine do you have? What configurations do you need? We list out what is needed to set up each of those integrations. And sometimes it requires things like edge modules and FOLIO. Sometimes it's as simple as making sure the barcodes don't look weird when they're on the receipt printer. So it really depends on what we're talking about. And then we go ahead and we test everything that we can, and we come up with contingencies for anything that we can't. Because unfortunately, it is the reality that not every integration has a production and test system. That's just the way that some systems work, right? So some things we're going to have to sort of, a friend of mine told me this, I think it was huck and pray was the phrase. It's a snowboarding term. Some of these things we're just going to have to take on faith and come up with contingencies if it doesn't work on day one. Also beyond the data, we need to set up discovery. And discovery is technically an integration when we're looking at this from the perspective of FOLIO. It is, however, also an entirely separate implementation project with its own steps and its own sort of like processes that we need to follow. So for discovery, sort of like from the FOLIO perspective, what we're going to do is set up connection points. We're going to collect information about how to set up your system if we need to do anything special. For that site itself, we're going to iterate through issues with the site. And then additionally, once we get to setting up discovery, we're also going to be setting up integrations on top of that integration, if that makes sense. So you might have other data sources. You might have like a libchat thing that needs to be put in your discovery layer, things like that. So this one can take up a pretty good chunk of time. And then also beyond the data, we have reporting. So also this is technically an integration, kind of. But we spend significant time setting it up and preparing to use it, right? So we need to know what reports you're using so that we can translate those reports into your new system if they are things that you need on day one. A lot of times they're not, so a lot of libraries will put this off until they actually need it, right? But the other important thing is we often migrate data into your reporting system or we store it entirely separately. So anything that you need from your legacy system needs to go somewhere. This is often one of those somewheres. Is there anything else we do during a migration? Yes. Yes, there is. So we frequently have other aspects to the sort of setting things up phase of a migration that we couldn't possibly have known about ahead of time. So for example, a second library appears, a thing that has happened. Data has been hiding in a virtual drawer this whole time. You have something that you consider part of the library that we might not have guessed. And this does happen, FOLIO has changed, right? So FOLIO has changed in such a way that we now need to go back and re-implement something. Like we now have a claiming app, and do we need to move information into that claiming app's data? So how do we solve this? Well, we can't prepare for it in advance. So I like to think of it as sort of like lovingly valeting every car into and out of our parking garage because it's way too big to be a parking lot. So as long as we know about everything eventually, we can eventually take care of it, is how we look at that. When does all of this happen? That's a great question. So we have libraries that need to migrate in a month and libraries that need to migrate in a year. Um, there's a lot of in between in there. It's really dependent on your schedule. The thing that I like to highlight, though, is that even though we have this really specific plan at the beginning that tells you which month we're going to be doing each of these things, or even down to the week, we try to stay flexible. So we want to make sure that we're moving forward on anything that isn't blocked as we can. It can be very easy to fixate on like, oh, we can't move forward on adding our users because we have a problem with extracting the data. Well, it's like, okay, we can move on to inventory because that's not actually dependent on users. So we try to look for any way that we can move forward in order to keep things moving smoothly. All right, now we have our rehearsals. So one of the things that we do as we're getting close to going live is we do practice migrations. So we'll do dry runs that involve wiping out your Folio test system, doing a fresh extract of legacy data, transforming and loading all of the data. We'll time each of those steps so we know how long each of them take. We'll chase down any errors, and then we'll do essentials tests again to verify successful migration. These are usually pretty boring from the library's perspective, but very exciting on my side, I promise. So this is where we get to know that we did everything correctly. Another thing that we need to take care of as we're getting close to go live is training. Index data usually uses a train the trainer model. So we train people at your organization in order to have you train them. I could talk about this for literally hours, and some of you may have heard me doing that earlier at this conference. So we'll drop this one here, but suffice it to say, you're gonna have to train your people, and that's gonna be a huge chunk of time. And then we have the thing I have never managed to sell anyone on ever, which is our day in the life exercise. So for some reason, no one wants to do this really cool thing we came up with. However, we're still pretty invested in this concept. So what we would like people to do, what we think would be an ideal thing for people to do, would be to try and run your legacy system and your new system in parallel for a day, right? Just make sure that the normal things that you do in a day are working so that we know that on day one of your go live, nothing's going to be broken, right? This is really hard to do on the ground in a library. Most people do not have the staff to do an event like this. We think it would be cool. No one else agrees, but maybe one of you will be the takers, right? Yes? I love that. So, uh, sorry, which? BVB. Okay. Suzanne from BVB says that they did this for circulation and it was awesome. I'm sorry, I blanked on which of the Bs it was. Um, okay. All right. For your go live, we are also going to need to do some planning. So for every migration, we have yet more spreadsheets that we create. So this one is a detailed to-do list that tells us everything that needs to happen step by step for a migration. You would think that this would be fairly straightforward since we just did this during planning. However, it is actually fairly complicated. If we need to, we are going to include timings based on the dry runs. So for a very large library, we need to know exactly how long it takes to migrate inventory so that we know that we can complete all of these steps within a single weekend. For a smaller library, we sometimes don't bother with that because it really stresses people out. And if we know for sure we're going to have time to do it, then why add the complication, right? So we plan our go lives around any of the institution's constraints. So we're not gonna migrate you on the day that like your systems librarian is in France getting married or something like that. So we can work around you. You choose your go live date, and then we're going to update this sheet as the go live happens. So usually we just have these things change color or we check them off. And it's a great secondary way to communicate progress because of course we will be communicating live with you as these things happen as well. Now, depending on how complicated your migration is, we might ask you to do another thing that libraries don't love doing, but I insist on, which is what I've called a line through. Basically, what we're going to ask you to do is walk through the entire migration out loud, step by step, to make sure that we didn't miss any steps. Because if we are working together in order to get your data out and put it in the system, it's very easy to miss a step like Tara is going to extract the data and then she's going to send it to Charles, right? Well, where is she sending it to Charles? And how is she sending it to Charles? And when is she sending it to Charles? All of those questions need to be answered. So it's a really great way for us to find sort of assumptions between the steps on our list. But it takes a long time and it's super awkward, but it's important. All right. And I've called this section curtain call because by the time we're actually doing the thing, it's basically like taking a bow, right? We did all that preparation. This part's nothing. So a typical go live, the timing, there's two sort of strategies that I've seen people use. The first is the sort of weekend strategy, and people like this because it minimizes downtime, right? So your legacy system goes offline on a Friday evening. So you do your work during the day on Friday, and then you go down, and no one does any circulation over the weekend. The actual data migration is going to be done on Saturday. Your systems are going to be verified on Sunday, so your staff are going to be in there doing their essentials tests once again. And then on Monday, you have coffee and folio and life continues and it's no big deal. There is also a second strategy that I've seen that I like because I think it's less stressful for people. So you can also do your migration over a week. This one's pretty popular. So your legacy system goes offline on a Monday. Your staff operate offline for 1 week, and that's pretty hard if you have a lot of circulation. So that is sort of an issue here. The actual migration happens at a slower pace. So we sometimes do like one data set, 1 or 2 data sets a day. Your systems are going to be verified by Friday. You have a weekend of light testing and possible overflow. If we're ahead of time, then you could even potentially go live a little bit early. But on Monday, you have your coffee and folio and life continues as normal. So at this step, yay, you're live. Woohoo. However, what if the chandelier drops? What if things do not go as we are expecting? Well, that's okay. So sometimes we're going to have some drama. Every once in a while, we have a not so boring go live, happens to the best of us. And this can happen for a couple of reasons. One of them is that there's something new in the data. So something that we didn't see during any of those tests earlier was added to the data, and now we have to deal with that. So that's a pretty common one. Another one is something was missed during the review phase. So if you miss something during all of those essentials tests, we may need to stop the migration and deal with it if it gets caught even this late in the game, if it's something big. Another one that's fairly likely is having something missed during go live planning. So we missed a step, we're missing something that we need in order to move forward, and we need to take a pause, reassess, and then restart. And then we also sometimes there's a flood. Sometimes there's a disconnect. There's an accident or a mishap or an emergency or another event outside of our control, and we need to just stop and deal with that. So those are some of the ways that we can have drama, and I believe all of these have actually happened. But what I wanted to say is that's okay, all right? So sometimes things go wrong, and here's what's going to happen if they do. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to assess the situation. So what's the best way to resolve this exact problem? And we don't know what that problem is yet because hopefully it's not going to happen. So some of the options we have are delaying the go live. We can delay for a little while, or we can actually just say, actually, we're going to bail. We're going to do a complete redo, and that's okay. We'll reschedule. And you go back to using your legacy system if you can, and we start all over again. The next thing is maybe we can fix it and move forward, or we can fix it and move forward after you go live. Sometimes the data isn't as important as having you live on the system, so that's another option. And then another possibility is stopping and fixing the issue right now live, even though it's a little bit risky. Sometimes that's the best solution to the problem. But the other important thing is that if we do find ourselves with drama, everyone stops to help. This is now the most important thing that we do as a company because these go live events are very important. So if something goes wrong during your go live, the person who is in my role, your project manager, is going to call on whoever they need to call on to get the job done. We've got lots of great minds on the issue, so you don't need to worry too much. We will get this fixed. I do think it's important to note that just like a plane, it is more likely that we're having a rough landing than actually crashing the plane. I'm not even really sure how you could crash the plane short of having your go live go wrong and then also simultaneously maliciously destroying your legacy system. That's the only actual emergency I can think of. So, probably things are going to be fine. The other thing that I like to point out is that if this happens, it does not matter whose fault it is. It only matters that the problem got solved. So it is possible that you made a mistake, and I don't care. It's fine. Ultimately, it's my problem. It's everything at Index Data is ultimately my fault. So you can just hold that in your heart as you are telling us that you have found a problem that you really should have noticed 2 months ago, but you didn't. I'm not going to be mad. The only thing that matters is that we get the problem solved. Okay? So some notes. One thing that the ghost Mike Gorell, who originally did this presentation, told me that I really loved is we get credit for good projects, not good project plans. So all of those spreadsheets and all those things that I lovingly create, none of that matters. No one's going to look at them after you go live. It's totally fine. We only get credit for your go live. And then my main lesson is that we need to stay flexible. So migrations never go the way we think. We have, in fact, completely replanned migrations in the middle because our initial approach wasn't working or something in the context changed that required that we do that. And that's fine. I know it always feels bad to go back and do something different from what you said, but all that really means is we need some extra communication and we're doing the smartest thing in the moment. I did want to highlight, for anyone who doesn't know this, I'm one of the co-conveners of the Implementers SIG, a great resource for migrating libraries. We did a really cool session where we asked libraries to come in and tell us their tips and tricks. And that's available here at this link. The slides are on Sched, of course. And especially this board here, which I know will not open if I click on this link. So we'll just imagine that it's there. It includes a lot of notes from people who have gone live and the lessons that they learned, and I thought it was really valuable. So I definitely recommend checking that out. So it takes a lot of work to make something this complicated into something boring, but it is worth it. It will be worth it on the day. So I hope that I've convinced you of that with all of my gazillion spreadsheets. And that is everything I've got. Do you have any questions here or on Zoom? Also, I keep hearing applause, which makes me think that this is over, but I don't think it is. What time does this session end? In 2 minutes. All right, we're done. No questions. Well, hopefully there's no questions on Zoom. Lauren?
Yeah, there's no questions on Zoom.
All right, is everyone tired and everyone wants to go home now? Everyone wants one last barbecue and to go home. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you had fun and I hope you had a great conference, okay? Thanks.